Driving at night always had its peculiar charm. Empty roads, cool air, and the glow of headlights piercing the darkness. I had done it countless times, my job requiring me to take long trips across the state. But there was something different about that night. A sense of unease that crept into my thoughts as I cruised down the desolate highway. It was around 2 a.m. when it happened. The road was empty, not a single car in sight, just the whispering wind and the steady hum of my engine. I was somewhere between two small towns, miles away from any sign of civilization, when I saw it, a figure standing on the side of the road. I slowed down, instinctively curious but also cautious. Something about her presence felt off. As my car approached, she raised her hand, signaling for me to stop. I hesitated. Every horror movie I'd ever seen screamed at me to keep driving, to get as far away from her as possible. But my hand, almost against my will, turned the steering wheel, pulling the car over to the side. I rolled down the window just enough to speak. "Do you need help?" I asked, my voice echoing unnaturally in the quiet night. She didn't answer. Instead, she slowly turned her head toward me, revealing her face. It was pale, almost translucent in the moonlight, and her eyes were hollow, dark voids that seemed to swallow the light around them. A chill ran down my spine as I realized there was no life in those eyes, no soul behind them. I was frozen, unable to move or speak. She took a step closer, her gaze locked onto mine, and for a moment, I felt an overwhelming sense of dread, like I was staring into the abyss itself. My heart pounded in my chest, my instincts screaming at me to get out of there, but I couldn't tear my eyes away from her. Then, just as suddenly as it began, the spell broke. I slammed my foot on the gas pedal, the tires screeching as I sped away, leaving the woman behind. I glanced in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see her standing there, but she was gone, vanished as if she had never been there at all. The rest of the drive was a blur. I reached the nearest town just as dawn was breaking, the warmth of the sun finally easing the cold fear that had gripped me. I told myself it was a hallucination, a trick of the mind brought on by exhaustion and the dark. But deep down, I knew it was something more, something that defied explanation. A week later, I was back on the road, driving the same route. I had almost convinced myself that night had been a bad dream, that the woman was just a figment of my imagination. But then, as I passed the same stretch of highway, I saw it. An old, rusted sign partially hidden by overgrown bushes. It marked the site of an accident that had happened years ago. A woman had died there, hit by a car while she was stranded on the side of the road. My blood ran cold as I realized the date on the sign. It was the same night I had seen her, down to the exact hour. And now, every time I drive at night, I can't shake the feeling that she's still out there, waiting for another lost traveler to stop and offer her a ride, only to find out they're the ones who'll never make it home. I had been driving all night, the monotony of the highway lulling me into a strange, half-conscious state. The glow of the dashboard was the only light in the car, casting eerie shadows on the empty seat beside me. I'd been on the road for hours, heading to a distant town for a job that couldn't wait until morning. The highway was deserted, not a single car in sight, just the endless ribbon of asphalt stretching out before me. The radio was off, the silence almost oppressive, broken only by the soft hum of the tires on the road. I was starting to regret taking this trip at night, but I was too far in to turn back now. It was around 3 a.m. when I saw him, a lone figure standing by the side of the road. He was just barely visible in the dim light, but there was no mistaking that he was there, his thumb extended in the universal gesture for hitchhiking. I didn't think twice. It was late, and the nearest town was still miles away. Whoever this was, they needed help. I slowed down and pulled over, rolling down the passenger window. "Need a ride?" I called out. The man stepped closer, and I could see him more clearly now. He was tall, with a gaunt face and eyes that seemed too dark, too hollow. But it was his smile that unnerved me, a grin that stretched too wide, like it didn't quite belong on his face. "Thanks," he said, his voice low and raspy. He opened the door and slid into the seat beside me, pulling it shut with a soft click. The car suddenly felt smaller, the air heavier, as if the temperature had dropped several degrees. I shook off the feeling, telling myself it was just my imagination. We drove in silence for a while, the stranger staring straight ahead, his hands resting on his knees. I tried to make small talk, asking where he was headed, but his answers were vague, almost disinterested. Something about him felt off, but I couldn't put my finger on it. As the minutes passed, I started to feel uneasy. The road seemed longer than it should have been, like we were driving in circles. The darkness outside pressed in on the car, and I found myself glancing at the man beside me more often than I liked. He hadn't moved, hadn't spoken, just sat there with that unsettling smile. Then, without warning, he turned to me, his dark eyes locking onto mine. "Do you believe in fate?" he asked, his voice sending a shiver down my spine. Before I could answer, he leaned closer, his face inches from mine. "Because tonight, fate brought us together." I slammed on the brakes, the car skidding to a stop in the middle of the road. "Get out!" I shouted, panic rising in my chest. The man didn't move, just kept staring at me with that unnerving grin. I said, "Get out," I repeated, my voice trembling. Finally, he reached for the door handle, but not before leaning in close and whispering, "You'll see me again, you know. Fate doesn't let go that easily." With that, he stepped out of the car, disappearing into the darkness as if he had never been there. I drove off as fast as I could, my hands shaking on the steering wheel. I didn't stop until I reached the next town, the lights of civilization bringing a sense of relief. But even now, I can't shake the feeling that he was right, that our paths are destined to cross again. And next time, I might not be so lucky. I've always been a night owl, preferring the quiet solitude of the roads when the world is asleep. The long stretches of highway, lit only by the pale glow of my headlights, have always given me a sense of peace. But that changed one fateful night when I picked up a stranger. It was a little past midnight, and I was driving along a desolate stretch of road, miles away from the nearest town. The darkness was thick, almost suffocating, with no other cars in sight. The only sound was the steady hum of my engine and the occasional rustling of trees swaying in the wind. As I rounded a bend, my headlights caught something on the side of the road. A man standing alone, his thumb extended in the universal sign for a hitchhiker. He was dressed in a black coat, the collar pulled up against the cold, and his face was obscured by shadows. I hesitated for a moment, but something compelled me to pull over. He opened the passenger door without a word and slid into the seat beside me. "Thanks," he muttered, his voice low and gravelly. I nodded, glancing at him briefly before focusing back on the road. There was something off about him, something I couldn't quite place. We drove in silence for a while, the tension in the air thick enough to cut with a knife. The man stared straight ahead, his face still hidden in the shadows. I couldn't shake the feeling that I had made a mistake, but it was too late to turn back now. After what felt like an eternity, he finally spoke. "You're going the wrong way." I frowned. "What do you mean?" "This road leads to the highway." He turned to look at me, and for the first time, I saw his face clearly. His eyes were cold, empty, and there was something in them that sent a chill down my spine. "You should have taken the last exit." A sense of dread washed over me. I hadn't seen any exits, and the GPS hadn't mentioned any. "What exit?" I asked, trying to keep the tremor out of my voice. He didn't answer, just continued to stare at me with those unnerving eyes. I felt my pulse quicken, and a sense of urgency gripped me. I pressed down on the gas, desperate to get away from him. But the road seemed to stretch on endlessly. Suddenly, the radio crackled to life, static filling the car. I reached out to turn it off, but the man grabbed my wrist, his grip icy cold. "Don't," he whispered, his voice barely audible over the static. Then the voice came through. It was a woman's voice, trembling with fear. "If you're out there, please, don't pick him up. He's not human." My blood ran cold. I yanked my hand away and swerved to the side of the road, bringing the car to a screeching halt. I turned to confront the man, but the seat beside me was empty. The door was still closed, and there was no sign of him anywhere. Heart pounding, I checked my rearview mirror, but there was nothing behind me. I was alone on the road, or so I thought. Shaking, I turned the car around and sped back the way I came, my eyes darting to every shadow, every flicker of movement. I finally reached an exit that I hadn't seen before and took it without hesitation. I never drove at night again. Don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe for more real-life horror stories that will keep you up at night.